Check your thermostat right now. It probably says somewhere between 68 and 72 degrees. You set it once, years ago, and forgot it existed. You've never had to think about where that warmth actually comes from, or what it costs to make a room feel like nothing is wrong outside it. The image you probably have of ancient humans is the same image everyone has. Shivering figures, huddled around a tiny fire, barely making it through the night, waiting for the sun. Now picture the actual ground beneath an Ice Age camp, 800,000 years ago, and the deliberate, engineered hole someone dug straight down into it, on purpose, with tools. Your ancestors mostly didn't live in caves at all. In some of the coldest, most lethal winters this planet has ever produced, they went underground, on purpose, with a level of precision that should not be possible without a single piece of modern science. So how did a species with no thermometers, no science, no written knowledge figure out the exact physics of using the Earth itself as insulation? And why does that discovery still outperform some of our own modern survival technology? Let's talk about what the cold actually felt like. We're talking minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit on the Eurasian steppe. Not the cold you feel walking to your car. The kind of cold where exposed skin begins to die within minutes. Where breathing hurts. Where the wind doesn't just chill you, it hunts you. A modern human dropped into that environment unprepared would likely be dead before sunrise. And yet, at Kostenki in Russia, dating back roughly 800,000 years, researchers found circular depressions, up to 8 feet deep, 12 feet across. These weren't natural formations. Tool marks in the surrounding soil prove they were deliberately excavated to remarkably consistent depths across multiple sites. And that depth is not arbitrary. At 6 to 8 feet below the surface, ground temperature stays roughly 20 to 30 degrees warmer than the air above, even in extreme winter conditions. A real, measurable thermal effect that ancient humans had clearly identified and were deliberately exploiting. 800,000 years before anyone had a word for geothermal insulation. On paper, this should not work. A species with no thermometers, no concept of geothermal physics, no written knowledge transfer at all, should not have been able to identify the single most effective depth for passive insulation, and then replicate it precisely, site after site, for hundreds of thousands of years. There's no textbook for this. There's no formula they could have looked up. So how did they actually figure out that going down was the answer? And how far did that idea actually go? The Kostenki depressions weren't randomly sized holes. Researchers found consistent depth ranges across multiple excavated sites, strongly suggesting the precise thermal benefit of 6 to 8 feet underground had been identified, tested, and deliberately repeated across generations. This is systematic, transmitted environmental knowledge, nearly 1 million years before written language existed. Observation, refined into a reliable, repeatable technique, and passed down through direct demonstration and practice. Picture an early human, generations after the first depression was ever dug, choosing a new campsite, and without hesitation, beginning to dig down to roughly the same depth their parents and grandparents always had. They had no idea why 6 to 8 feet worked better than 3 feet, or worse than 12. They simply knew, through inherited experience, passed down by watching and doing, that this was the depth that kept people alive through the worst nights of the year. That knowledge had no name. It didn't need one. Your ancestors didn't fight the cold by building higher. They fought it by going lower. And the ground did the rest. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, dating to roughly 26,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered winter shelters with walls built from multiple distinct layers, each one serving a precise thermal function. Innermost, animal hide, fur facing inward, trapping warm air against the body. Middle, dried grass and moss, wicking moisture away. Outermost, woven mats of reed and bark, wind-resistant, but breathable enough to let moisture escape before it could freeze and structurally destroy the shelter from within. This is the same layering logic behind a modern winter jacket, or a wall's vapor barrier and insulation system. Different materials, identical physics. Picture someone building this wall, layer by layer, with no concept of vapor barrier or insulation. Simply knowing because they'd watched it fail before, watched moisture freeze inside a poorly built wall and destroy it from within over a single brutal night. Exactly which material needed to go where. Hide facing in, moss in the middle, bark facing out. No formula, no diagram, just a precise, repeatable solution, built into muscle memory and passed down the same way you'd teach a child anything urgent enough to matter. They never had the word insulation. They just had a wall that worked, built exactly the way modern insulation is built, thousands of years before anyone could explain why. At sites including Mezhrich and Kostenki in Ukraine and Russia, researchers discovered actual engineered buildings, constructed almost entirely from the bones of woolly mammoths. Mammoth skulls each weighing over 200 pounds, used as foundation blocks, larger bones forming the structural framework. Hide stretched over the top for an outer shell. Interior temperatures inside reconstructed versions of these structures have been estimated at 40 to 50 degrees warmer than outside conditions. And modern Arctic shelters, using industrial insulation and electric heating, have, in some documented comparisons, performed no better. Picture the effort involved in building one of these. Dragging mammoth skulls, each heavier than a grown adult, into precise position. Stacking and arranging bones, not randomly, but as deliberate structural framework. Stretching hide taut across the top to complete an outer shell capable of holding warmth through the worst months of the year. This wasn't shelter assembled in a panic. This was a building, designed and constructed with the same intentionality as anything an engineer draws up today, just built from the only materials a frozen landscape had to offer. They built a working building with a 50-degree temperature swing inside it, using nothing but bone, hide, and a complete understanding of how to make them work together. No metal, no glass, no modern tool ever touched it. Here's the part that changes how big this story actually is. Every reveal so far makes underground and engineered shelter look like a purely physical survival solution. But these shelters may not have just kept people alive. They may have shaped the emergence of human culture itself. Many famous Paleolithic Venus figurines were discovered specifically in winter shelter contexts. And associated cave art appears to have been created largely during the long months of winter confinement that underground and bonehouse living made possible. The art that helped define our species as cognitively and symbolically modern wasn't made in the comfort of summer abundance. It was made by firelight, underground, or inside bone houses, while the world outside was locked in ice. The engineering didn't just preserve human bodies through the winter. By creating long stretches of enclosed, firelit, socially concentrated time, it may have directly enabled the explosion of art, storytelling, and symbolic culture that followed. The hole in the ground wasn't just shelter from the cold. It may have been one of the conditions that made us creative. Go back to your thermostat. The number on it represents a temperature your ancestors would have considered miraculous. Not because they couldn't achieve warmth. They could, and did, in conditions far more extreme than anything you'll ever face. But because achieving it cost them everything. Every warm night required weeks of preparation, months of planning, continuous physical labor, and an engineering knowledge so precise that a single mistake could mean a family frozen before dawn. The ease with which you adjust a number on a wall is the end product of hundreds of thousands of years of exactly this kind of hard-won underground knowledge. You think of the ground as just the ground. Your ancestors looked at the exact same dirt and saw a thermostat, and they were right 800,000 years before you figured out how to set one. Every ruin we've walked through today only got found because someone went looking. If you want to keep digging with me, subscribe. There's a lot more buried than anyone's told you.